After seeing the industrialization through cotton and textile industry, we now move on to the iron and steel industry and the industrialization through that. The story of the industrialization of iron and steel industry begins from the sword of Tipu Sultan and the wood steel. Now, first, in order to learn about the wood steel, we should know that Tipu Sultan's sword was made up of woods, a high quality carbon steel produced all over the South India through a highly specialized way of refining iron, that is, iron smelting. The sword had very great qualities. It had a very sharp and water running edge. It can cut through an armor. So basically, Britishers were very curious about this kind of steel, and the sword is still preserved in the British museums. Why the Britishers became so interested in these kind of steel? Because the steel had certain qualities like the sharp running edge, and they had little carbon ingots in there. This was, produced by a very specialized way of refining iron that was also known as iron smelting. Of course, this came to a complete loss in the mid 19th century with the conquest of India by the British. But before that, it became so famous and it was so proper. It was propagated so widely that Michael Faraday, who also discovered the electromagnetism, he came to India to learn the properties of this process, to learn the properties of this material, and along with him, after a year of Tipu Sultan's death in 1800 century, Francis Buchanan also came to India to know about how the process of iron smelting is done. What is the process through this wood steel is made? And he wrote a very detailed account of how a wood steel is made, like when the iron ore is, mixed up with the charcoal and they are kept in a clay pot. There's a whole detailed process that he wrote, that how a wood steel was made in India. Of course, it came to an end. The process was completely lost by the mid 19th century because the swords were no more in use. The British conquered and British occupied all the territories in India, and obviously there were no other rulers who could stand oppose them. So basically, this process of iron smelting for the production of the swords and various other things came to an end after the British conquest. Let's move on to the abandoned furnaces in the villages. So after the Britishers came to India, obviously they also had their own industry in England as well. So they began importing the goods from England to India. And the Indian producers, rather than having their own products, they shifted to the products of the Britishers because they were cheap and they came in a very, very large quantities. In central India, smelting was done by the men in furnaces of clay and sun-dried bricks, while women worked the bellows. So here also we can see, in textile also we had gender-specific roles. Here also we see a gender-specific role in which smelting was done by the male, and working with the bellows was done by the female. Obviously, this craft declined by the late 19th century due to introduction of new forest laws and the import of iron and steel from Britain. Now we have to see what were the new forest laws. So the Britishers, when they conquered India, when they occupied the Indian territories, they also imposed some of the new forest laws which banned the local people from going into the reserve areas of reserve forest. So from the forest only, they used to gain the raw material of wood, and that is how the charcoal came into picture. But now they were not allowed the access to the forest. That is why one of the raw materials could not be gained. So basically, their access to one of the raw materials was inhibited, and that is how they could not shift onto the other processes. That is how their production decreased tremendously. Some of the people, they used to, hide from the government, and they used to go in hiding to the forest, and they used to bring wood from there. But that could not. So the people, they used to go to the forest secretly and they used to procure these raw materials, the wood. But obviously they couldn't do it for long, and so their manufacturing also declined. Now, some of the forest areas were opened by the Britishers, but there were taxes imposed on procuring those goods. So because of the taxes, the cost of the production increased, and because of the cost of the production increased, the cost of the final goods also increased, and that is why the goods of the Indian steel and Indian iron ore saw a huge rise, and that is how the the imports that were happening from the Britishers that came from the Britain saw an uprising because their cost was cheap. So that is how there were many abandoned furnaces in the villages. The craftsmen of the iron ore smelting processes, they left their villages. They were unemployed. They were left unemployed, and they left their villages in search of other jobs. Now, there's a question: Why would the iron and steel industry? Why would iron and steel making industry be affected by the defeat of the Nawabs and Rajas? Because Nawabs and Rajas used to order huge amount of armory products, swords, and other products which used iron and steel. But now that the British occupied most of the territories of India, there was no one who could stand opposed to them. So basically, the demand from the Nawabs and Rajas for making of swords and other items that were used in the wars or for the maintenance of the army declined, and therefore the iron and steel making industry was also affected by the defeat of the Nawabs and the Rajas. Now, coming to the iron and steel factories coming up in India. So basically, Jamshedji Tata sought that he would invest a huge amount of money in establishing an iron and steel industry in India. And his elder son, that is Dorabji Tata, along with Charles Weld, found the fine iron ore supply of Rajhara Hills in 1904 with the help of Agaria tribe of the Smelters. So they were gone on the discovery of iron ore, where they could find iron ore, and basically they came across a group of people who were carrying iron ore on their head, and they asked that where they found those. They pointed to the Rajhara Hills, and there these two people, Charles Weld and Dorabji Tata, found iron ore deposits, but they could not single-handedly, they could not at once go upon and exploit these iron ores, because it was a dry land, and for any factory for establishment, it needs a continuous water supply. So on the banks of Subarnarekha River in Jamshedpur, the Tesco, that is Tata Iron and Steel Company, was established in 1912. So the Tata Iron and Steel Company, that is Tesco, was set up on the banks of Subarnarekha River that started producing steel in the 1912. The expansion of the railways in India provided a huge market. So Tesco was established with a great fortune. Number one, the first reason for it, which it had a great fortune, was because the Britishers had sought the establishment of railways for a better transportation facility in India, throughout India. So for that, initially they had thought that they will procure the raw materials from the Britain itself. They would import the iron and steel products, and that would also have a twofold profit for them, because they will have a market for the market for the iron and steel in India, and they will also develop the railways by their own raw materials. But that is the first establishment of railways. The second reason was the onset of 1914, the First World War. The First World War broke out in 1914, and because of that, the Britishers could not export raw materials, that is iron and steel, to India, because they had their own supplies to cater to. So for the production of the arms and for the needs of the army and military, they could not supply the iron and steel to India, and rather than that, they had to use the India's iron and steel industry for the manufacture of the carriages and wagons for in the use of World War I. So because of these two reasons, Tesco flourished greatly. It had a very good fortune that the establishment of railways was made from the iron ore and steel supplied by the Tesco, and the World War I also saw contribution of Tesco to the Great Britain because they supplied raw materials for the production of carriages and wagons. Going to the impact of the First World War, imports of British steel into India declined, leading to an increase in demand for iron and steel manufactured by Tesco. Tesco became the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. So within the British Empire, British obviously did not provide any protection to the indigenous producers in the same way as they did provide to the people in Britain, to the producers in Britain, as we saw in the Calico Act. But here, Tesco was a monopoly flourishing under the British Empire because of the World War First, because of the impacts of the First World War. The Britishers could not procure enough raw material for themselves, so they could not export it to India. So Tesco was looked upon for the needs of the Indian market, and therefore it greatly benefited from the First World War. And it became the biggest steel industry in the British Empire. Now, before we move on to the question, we should always remember that the First World War had impact on both the industries, that is textile and the iron and steel industry, because both the industry saw a great boon and boost after the First World War, because the Britishers, they were focused on their benefit in the First World War. They were focused on the First World War, so they could not, think about the export to India. They could not about the market. They had to cater to the other needs of theirs. So because of that, the textile and the iron and steel industry flourished greatly in India because of the impacts of the First World War. Now, let's move on to the question. Question number 1 is, what kind of cloth had a large market in Europe? So basically, there were two kinds of clothes that had large market in Europe. It was chint, chinti, and there was bandana. These two had a very large market in Europe. They were very popular, and because of that, this was also banned by the Calico Act. Let's move on to the next question. The next question is, what is jamdani? So jamdani is jamdani is a textile product which is finely woven with the thread of gold and cotton, and which is usually in gray or white texture. It is exquisite in nature because of its very fine pattern that is given in the jamdani cloth. It was manufactured in mostly Dhaka and Southeast India. What is bandana? So bandana is a kind of scarf that was worn during the British Empire, and it was manufactured in India. It had floral prints, it has prints and designs, and it was a finely woven cloth. Question 4 is, who are the Agaria? So the Agarias were a community which specialized in the craftsmanship of iron ore smelting. They lost their significance because of the import of iron and steel from the Britain, and so they moved on to finding other employments in the later 19th century. But after that, some of the Agarias still continue to exist. They speak in Hindi and Chhattisgarhi language. They are found in the central region of India. Question 5 is, fill in the blanks. The word chins come from cheat. The word chins come from the Hindi word cheat. Tipu's sword was made of wood steel. India's textile export declined in the 19th century. Question 6 is, how do the names of different textiles tell us about their history? So the names of different textiles had a great significance attached to them. It shows us what are the histories of the textile. Like we saw for muslin, it was propagated and promoted by the Arabs to the European market and the American market. So Arabians have written in their books the stories of muslin, which was famously called as muslin by the Europeans as well. Then there is calico, which was promoted by the Portuguese. Then there is chins. Then there is bandana. Each of these different textile has a story of their own. Then there is also khadi. Khadi also tells us the story of our national movement. It became a national symbol. So each of these clothes had a different story to tell. They were each propagated and promoted by various events and histories, and their promotion also somehow directly or indirectly led to the industrialization and manufacturing of textile in India as well as in Britain. Now, question 7 is, why did the wool and silk producers in England protest against the import of Indian textiles in early 18th century? The wool and the silk producers in England protested against the import of the Indian textiles because their own indigenous textiles that were manufactured and produced by the local people of the Europe. So because of the huge promotion of the Indian textile in the European markets, the European manufacturers suffered a great setback because they were also initiating the manufacturing process and they were not so famous. So basically, they demanded the British government to ban all these Indian textile products in order to their manufacturing industry to flourish, to gain profits. So that is why the wool and the silk producers in England protested against the import of the Indian textile in the early 18th century. Moving on to the next slide. Question 8 is, how did the development of cotton industries in Britain affect textile producers in India? So the development of cotton industries in Britain assured one thing, that the Indian raw materials were not needed in the Europe anymore for the consumption and for the sale of the Indian goods. So after the huge mechanization of the textile industry, the industrialization in the textile industry, the Indian producers were left no market whatsoever in any form, because even though they were producing very fine quality of all the textiles, their product was not in demand because it had a relatively higher cost rate than the British product, which had a cheaper rate. And also they were produced in huge quantities. British, they sought to promote their own goods rather than selling the Indian goods, of course. So that is how the Indian textile producers suffered a great setback due to the development of cotton industry in Britain, because their market saw a decline in the growth. Most of the people went unemployed after that. Question 9 is, why did the Indian iron smelting industry decline in the 19th century? The Indian iron smelting industry declined in the 19th century because of the rapid industrialization process in the Great Britain. The industrialization process meant that iron and steel industry in Britain was growing rapidly, and India served as one of the markets for these iron and steel industry, because the Britishers were selling these iron and steel ores to the Indians to create a market in India. And that is why the Indian manufacturers, the Indian craftsmen of iron and steel industry could not get flourished, could not see growth in their business. And that is how they saw the decline in the industry. Question 10 is, what problems did the Indian textile industry face in early of its development? The Indian textile industry in early of its development faced a severe competition from the European industry. The European textile industry had mechanized way of manufacturing the textiles, and the Indian industry only had these manual laborers who used to hand wove the clothes, wove the clothes. So after the industrialization in India began in Bombay in the late 19th century, the mechanized way of producing these also started in India as well. So basically, initial competition from the European market posed a great problem to the Indian textile industry for its development. That was the earliest problem. Now, the 11th question is, what helped Tesco expand steel production during the First World War? In the course of First World War, Indian Railways had already taken off its production process. So the British could not export iron and steel to India for the manufacturing of the Indian Railways. So the Tesco was seen as help during the First World War for the manufacturing of the products of the Indian Railways, as well as Tesco was also seen to help the Britishers produce the wagons and the carriages for the First World War, because they could not have their certain amount of supply for their own wagons and carriages. So Tesco helped both the Britishers in the First World War and as well as the setting up of the Indian Railways. That expanded the steel production during the First World War, because Tesco was the only industry that supplied iron and ore, apart from the British iron and ore industry, which could not supply anymore during the First World War time. Now, for a quick revision of the whole chapter, mechanized production of cotton textiles made Britain the foremost industrial nation in the 19th century. The machines produced a huge amount of textile in the Britain, and it led the industrial revolution in the Great Britain. The industrialization of Britain had a close connection with the conquest and colonization of India, as before the industrialization began in Britain, India served as a country which exported the raw materials to the Great Britain. And after the industrialization happened in Europe, India posed as a market for those materials that were already manufactured in the Britain. So the conquest and colonization of India played a huge role in the industrialization of Britain. The introduction of the spinning jenny and the steam engine boosted the industrialization of textile industry in Britain. Obviously, the introduction of the spinning jenny was a huge comeback of the British textile production and manufacturers. The spinning jenny made the process faster, produced very quick materials, and produced materials in a huge quantity. The steam engine also boosted the industrialization. It gave a fast pace to the industrialization process. Expansion of the iron and steel industries occurred when British imports into India declined and the market for Indian goods increased. So the expansion of the steel industry obviously could occur only when the Britishers are prohibiting their own goods, dumping their own goods into the Indian market. The indigenous products for indigenous goods to see growth, to see progress, there was a need to stop the incoming of the British goods. So after the First World War, the British slowly prohibited the export of the iron and steel to India. They stopped looking the Indian as a dumping market. And during the First World War and post-war years, Tesco emerged as the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. Obviously, before that, British did not allow any of the industry to flourish when they had their own industry to take care of. So Britishers did not had any protection laws given to the Indian industries. They had the protection given to their own nation, but they could not give protection to the colonized nation. So after Tesco emerged as one of the huge iron and steel industry of India, the countrymen also realized the need of the protection of these indigenous industries. So after that, even the countrymen also became vigilant, and it resulted in Tesco emerging as the biggest steel industry within the British Empire. That's all for the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.